Hello and welcome, everyone. It's great to have you on tonight. Probably some people are still jumping on, and that's great. We're so happy to have you here for this 1 hour event. And as it turns out, it feels like a perfect moment, pretty much, to dive into everything that has just happened with the federal budget fight and to discuss what the implications are for the ongoing political work of our social justice movements. My name is Rose Mendelson. I'm the organizing director at Seed the Vote, and we're really excited to be co-hosting this event tonight with Convergence magazine. So I'm going to frame the conversation for us briefly before passing it on to our speakers, who you can see here on the side, and I'll intro them in a minute. Even before this year, we have been seeing how right-wing forces have been well-positioned to dominate our national budget battles because they have a clear and consistent narrative about taxes, about spending, about debt, and the role of government. And now an emboldened MAGA-led party has taken things further than in past fights, as we've seen, and they've built the power to force these really painful budget cuts that we're seeing by holding the debt ceiling hostage. Their tactics have made it really clear that they are willing to use incredibly undemocratic means to reverse any and all legislative gains from the past 3 years. And even while this is happening, this same budget showdown is being framed by the mainstream as a both sides issue, right? The president on one side should negotiate so as to avoid a default, and the House Republicans should compromise with the president. The mainstream framing really served to justify the far right's unreasonable tactics. And so we want to break that down, understand what really happened, and understand what we can do about it moving forward. Because the deal that has just been made is kind of still being made, but really was just made, and how it came about has huge implications, not only for major cuts to vital programs, but also the budget fights ahead and how Biden's stewardship of the economy is perceived going into the 2024 elections. So to understand what's going on and what we can do about it, we need to unpack the ways that the right frames budget issues and understand how to move forward our own framing instead. We also need to take a critical look at Biden's initial budget proposals to understand what his administration was ready to fight for and where we still need to push further in the future. And we need to, of course, assess the deal itself, what concessions he gave ultimately and where it leaves us. And so our speakers are going to get into the details, but I'll just say there's definitely an argument that this deal gives us some ammunition and leaves an opening to take control of the agenda away from the Freedom Caucus, who some think is, coming out of this actually looking somewhat weak, right? So there's definitely some bad, but it's not all bad. There's some potential openings we want to talk about too. And lastly, I'm sure we are all coming here with varying degrees of familiarity with how the federal budget fight works. And so for those of us who are less familiar, we want to demystify that process a bit in order to more easily understand how the right has tried to control the narrative around budgets, taxes, and spending. So to do that, first, Jason Negron Gonzalez, who's a Seed the Vote founding leader and our incoming political director, is going to lead us through a presentation that has some visuals. It's a PowerPoint. And then economist Eric Verhoeven and San Francisco Rising co-director Emily Lee are going to have a conversation to kind of dig in further, shed more light on the federal debt and other pieces of this fight, and on what's at stake for our communities, for the country, and for the upcoming elections. And so we're going to try and peel back the motives and strategies of the right, and also lift up opportunities in the future for us to take action around this, all in 1 hour. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jason to get us started.
Hey, everybody. So we're going to go through a slideshow right now, but I kind of want to, the purpose of the slideshow is basically to go through and set some context where this is not a normal budgetary fight. I think we're on the last slide. If we could go back to the first slide. It's not a normal budget fight. So how is it that we can kind of understand what we're seeing in this moment? MAGA extremists are threatening the global economy. What do they want? What's happening? And what's the deal with the debt ceiling in the first place? And how do we kind of wrap our heads around the reality that we've been in this last week or so, but actually going back a few weeks now, a few months in terms of this process, and going back almost a few decades in terms of these fights. So next slide. Next slide. Oh, perfect. So, oh no, go one more back. So first, I just want to put the debt ceilings in a broader context, right? So we're meeting on the day initially that Yellen said the government was going to run out of money, the treasury was going to run out of money to pay our debts. So what's going on with that? Like, what's really happening? Why should we even care about this? Next slide. So the first thing I think it makes sense to say again, and Rose made this point earlier, is that these debt ceiling fights have really been a phenomenon driven by the Republican Party over the last 30 years or so, right? So what do the Republicans want? I think the first occasion of the debt ceiling fight being taken over for political purposes was actually Gingrich back in 1995, led to a government shutdown. And then the Tea Party Republicans used a similar tactic twice under President Obama, once in 2011, once in 2013. So Republicans and extremists in the party are using the threat of default to basically force cuts that they can't move through the democratic legislative process, right? They don't have control of the government. They can't move the legislation that they want to move. So then they create this debt ceiling situation, right? To control the narrative, to control the political agenda, and ultimately to push demands ahead. Next slide. So first, controlling the narrative, right? And I think we've all seen how this situation has controlled the news cycle going back weeks now, right? So it gives Republicans a chance to expand their control of the narrative about budgets, taxes, and spending. I think it's worth saying that we saw under Trump that the Republicans aren't actually particularly concerned about running up deficits or having balanced budgets. Trump drastically increased the deficit in a number of different ways, but it's a place for them to be able to sow confusion and fear about the state of the economy, and then run down core points in terms of the narrative. There really are different versions of disinformation, like debt is bad, we need to control our spending or else it's out of control, the debt's out of control, the government's wasteful, we don't want to have the government spending on social programs and kind of dog whistles about where the money's spent. Who is it spent on? It's spent on takers. Who is it taken from? It's taken from makers, right? And it's going towards woke programs somehow. So we need to drown the government in the bathtub and cut back as much as we can because the government's out of control. Next slide. The purpose of the narrative then is to control the agenda, right? And to actually push austerity politics, which have been core politics for the Republican Party for decades, right? Roll back programs, shred safety net programs in particular, and then hamper the government's ability to do things for people, right? And at the same time, defend wealthy people from tax increases, right? So that's the agenda that they're pushing. And in some ways, you can see how those types of politics and those types of demands were kind of included at the core of what ended up being the negotiated settlement on this. But we'll come back to that later. Next slide. But again, the control of the narrative, the control of the political agenda were core going back all of the times we've had these debt ceiling fights. But in 2023, there's this particular interest in gaining strategic advantage in the 2024 election for Republicans, right? Harming their political opponents, weakening the Biden administration by threatening default, and demoralizing the voting bases that lean towards Democrats. Next slide. So debts, deficits, and defaults demystified. It's a tongue twister, right? But what do we actually need to know about debts and deficits to cut through the fog and challenge the right? Next slide. First off, debt, right? The deficit is like a deficit any of us would have. So when the federal government raises less in taxes and other revenues than it spends, that's to borrow the difference. That amount borrowed over a year is a deficit. The accumulation of deficits over time comprises the national debt. Most developed economies, all nations basically run at some level of debt. So the national debt of the United States is comparable to a lot of other countries. Eric and Emily can get into that later. But this debt ceiling is really an artificial limit to how much the Treasury can borrow to pay existing obligations to which Congress is committed. There's only, I think, 2 countries in the world that have debt ceiling situations. And the other one is a country in Europe whose name is escaping me, who actually has an extremely high limit. So in some ways, it's an artificial situation, this debt ceiling situation. Next slide. You may have heard, or it's sometimes said, that the debt has increased by 400% over the past 20 years or so. Why is that? I think it's also worth saying that the economy has grown by about 250% over the same time, right? But you'll hear 400%. This happened because, number one, there were trillion-dollar wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and now Ukraine, and large increases in military spending over that period of time. We've gone through multiple crises, the economic crisis in 2008, and the pandemic starting in 2020, and then massive tax cuts, right? Bush's tax cuts in 2003, but also Trump in 2017, cutting the corporate tax rate from 35 to 21%, huge cut, right? Basically trying to bankrupt the government in certain ways and force cuts by cutting revenues, and revenues at this point are not keeping up with the spending needs. Next slide. So what's another way to look at debt? I mean, debt is how governments and how we as a people invest in the things that we need, how we invest in infrastructure, social insurance, climate security, and more. So that, along with redistributive taxes, is a way to reduce inequality and strengthen democracy in our society. That borrowing takes the form of government bonds, which are also really important in their own right, right? So a government bond just represents a debt issued by a government and sold to investors to support government spending. Government bonds are considered to be really low risk investments because the government backs them, and the various types of the bonds that the Treasury issues are considered among the safest in the world and are an important part of the US economy. Next slide. But the right talks about debt in a different way, right? And I think that's what we've been hearing strongly over the last couple months, like to confuse the public about what debt is and what situation the United States is in right now relative to the question of debt, to manufacture a debt crisis to stop progressive spending and tax increases, and to weaponize the debt ceiling. And that's the reality we've been dealing with for the last period. Next slide. Now, there are real world consequences of defaulting on debt payments, right? And some of that was seen in '95 when they actually forced the government shutdown in a similar type of situation. Default disrupts the bond markets, disrupting all financial markets, could create recession. It creates a more challenging environment to finance public goods. It ensures that more cuts will come down the road and damaging the economy in ways that may benefit the right electorally. Next slide. Now what I want to do is take a moment to go back in a way that Rose was describing earlier and look at what were the contrasting budget priorities of the Democrats and Republicans early on in this process, and how did that lead to the compromise that we saw? Next slide. So Biden's proposal for 2024 as a part of the budget was to increase funding in a number of ways that reflect progressive values and priorities. Didn't hit everything, and it's worth seeing what isn't included, but there was provisions to lower prescription drug prices, expand the child tax credit and fund childcare, support supplemental education, boost funding for antitrust agencies so they could take on corporate mergers, mitigate climate-related catastrophes like wildfires, floods, and storms with targeted support for low-income areas and communities of color, improve pandemic preparedness and health surveillance, support climate research and clean energy development, and support public transit. Next slide. In addition to that, there were a number of proposed tax increases, which in a lot of ways are kind of common sense and reflect broad public sentiment. A minimum tax on billionaires of 25%, so that the wealthiest people can't get away with paying the least taxes that would impact the wealthiest 1/100%, which are the billionaires in the country. An increase in the tax rate on corporations back from the 21% that Trump cut it to 28%. A cut in tax rates for oil and gas companies, which still exist, and for real estate investors. A quadrupling of the tax on stock buybacks to basically focus on corporate buybacks as a way of increasing money for the corporation for shareholders. Ending tax breaks for the use of cryptocurrency transactions, and other reversals to Donald Trump's 2017 tax cuts to increase the tax rate for wealthy individuals. Next slide. What was the MAGA response? So the Republican Party waited a number of months and then basically released a bill that would cut billions of dollars from health coverage, food assistance, and give billions back to tax cheats. Some of these are the pieces that made through to the final negotiated proposal, putting a lot of folks at risk of losing health coverage, older people at risk of losing vital food assistance, 1 million children at risk for losing income assistance, forcing cuts over the next decade to different parts of the budget that fund defense, veterans health care, child care, medical research, schools, college aid, and transportation, giving billions back to tax cheats by cutting funding that ensures wealthy people pay their taxes, and extending the debt ceiling only for a year to basically, take hostages again a year from now and play the same games with our economy. Next slide. The McCarthy bill would basically give billions back to tax cheats and take billions from low-income families, and you can see some of that represented in this slide. Next slide. Now, what's the deal, right? So we're in a moment where there was a deal that was landed earlier this week, and in exchange for the suspending the debt ceiling for 2 years, the deal would do a number of things. Impose new work requirements for food stamps for people between the age of 49 and 54, and tighten work requirements for TANF. Claw back $30 billion in funding that was unspent from COVID. Repurpose $20 billion in funding from the IRS to basically compromise its ability to follow up on wealthy individuals and make them pay their taxes. Fast track permits for new energy projects, in particular greenlighting the Mountain Valley pipeline that Manchin had been pushing for. End the moratorium on student loan repayments effective in August, and cap non-defense discretionary spending for 2 years, which could force cuts to education, mental health and substance use treatment, childcare support, job training program, housing programs, rural development, small business assistance, and more. So a number of things that we don't like. I'll leave it to the panelists to talk more about some of the kind of political realities around this. But next slide. The White House, in some ways, I think what's been in the news a lot, and I think was mentioned, in recent days, is the Republicans are in revolt. The Republican Party is in revolt. The far right Republicans are angry at the agreement. So because they think that the White House is getting to claim too many victories, and the White House can claim some victories, right? So there's winning full funding for veterans health care, including a new program for veterans exposed to toxic chemicals, preventing work requirements for Medicaid beneficiaries, which would have been scandalous, avoiding another debt ceiling showdown until after the 2024 elections, although it will fall on the lame duck, defending funding for the Inflation Reduction Act, which is important for climate, and both sides wanting and winning a 3% increase in defense spending, which is something that both the Republicans and Biden agreed on. Next slide. So a couple words in summary, and then I'm going to pass it on to Emily and Eric. The first is, again, the MAGA forces have weaponized the debt ceiling to force the Biden administration into negotiating on their own terms that they wouldn't be able to otherwise accomplish. And they've manufactured a crisis and pushed the nation to the brink of default. To avert default, the Biden administration has made concessions, but the resulting deal harms some of the most vulnerable while protecting tax breaks for the rich. And that still hasn't been enough to satisfy the right wing of the Republican Party. I want to pass it to Emily and Eric to talk a little bit more about where do things stand now and what are the paths forward for progressive forces. Eric and Emily.
Thanks so much, Jason, for the overview. Well, first, I would just want to welcome any folks who might be joining us right now. Just as a reminder, you are in the Debt Ceilings, Federal Shutdowns, and Deficits, Oh My webinar, where we're going to be attempting to understand the federal budget fight and what's at stake for our movements. This is co-hosted by Seed the Vote and Convergence magazine. So thank you all for joining us. Eric and I will be having a conversation from the perspective of an economist and an organizer about these issues. So I'll start off by asking Eric a question that I've been struggling with too as I'm understanding and trying to read the news. Why do we even have a debt ceiling? Does it actually even serve a useful purpose?
Okay, I just unmuted myself. A good question. The short answer is no, it doesn't. It's kind of a quirk of history that the U.S. even has one. As Jason mentioned, there's basically one other country, which is Denmark, that has a debt ceiling. Congress already has a budget process where these things are hashed out and the appropriations are decided, and the government decides how much money to spend and on what. And the debt ceiling issue only arises when it comes time to pay for that spending that's already happened. And arguably, this debt ceiling law is in contradiction with the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which says the debt shall not be questioned. And so, and it never really came up before, about 2011. for the debt ceiling, in part because it was just routine. Everyone thought, of course, we have to raise the debt ceiling, and it was only sort of in recent years that was been weaponized by the Republicans in order to push austerity. And so now, effectively, what it does now is it gives them a chance to push austerity in a way, as Jason was saying, that they couldn't get through in the normal budget process. I'm not hearing Emily.
Sorry, just unmuted myself. Okay. A question I think that also comes up for a lot of regular people, and especially I think this is part of the question of what words we use, but isn't debt generally bad? Shouldn't we be trying to reduce our deficit spending? And how do we address debt given that we want to increase the budget because we can see clearly it's not addressing the needs of everyday working people?
When it's clear, you can't just spend willy-nilly forever, right? At some point you do have to pay down your debts. But I'd make two important points about this. One is there are times when you really have to invest in future growth, right? And so now is one of those times. We're not yet emerged from the COVID crisis. We're actually on the brink of a recession. Some people are already seeing signs that we might be heading into a recession. So it's not the time for austerity now. It's definitely going to austerity now would definitely push us into recession. And then the second point is there needs to be basic fairness about how the debt burden is shared. It can't just be on the backs of working people. That the Republican agenda, it's pretty clear, it came into stark relief in this whole debate, which is let's make it let it easier for rich people to avoid paying taxes and cut social programs. And so they're basically saying let's make the poor and working people pay for the debt burden and not so much on rich. And so obviously I think lots of people on this call think that it should be the other way. You need to raise taxes, especially raise taxes on rich people, and you need to protect the social programs, which are crucial, which are very important for people. Let me turn it around. Let me turn to the politics, and let me ask you, what's your assessment of how this fight went, and how who's winning the framing battle or the narrative battle around this whole issue? I'm not hearing Emily again.
Sorry. I was actually saying, I was just listening to a podcast that Crooked Media had done where they interviewed Anat Shenker-Osorio, who does a lot of messaging and narrative strategy for our movements, but also for the Democratic Party. And, in it, she talks a lot about the narrative. And, in my perspective, it's like we are losing the narrative fight because we keep using the words they're using, right? Like we keep talking about it as like, yes, it's about the debt ceiling, because that even just the words debt ceiling kind of implies like there's a ceiling and we've hit it, so we have to do something, right? And the idea that the right has framed it that the debt is bad and that both sides agree we have to get it under control. So as soon as you say that, like that it's out of control spending, I think the general public thinks, great, so it is out of control, and what are we supposed to do about it? We have to negotiate, otherwise we're going to have a default. So I think that it normalizes negotiation about the debt ceiling when, as Jason pointed out, it's only really happened 4 times previously. It's not a normal thing. But the right is using it as an opportunity for more austerity cuts, for, they're going to go after future, programs like Medicaid, even though they weren't able to make cuts to Medicaid this time. I think that you see like a template of like how they're going to be moving forward in future fights. So I do think that the narrative and the framing contest is something that the left and movements and Democrats have to really talk seriously about, because it is about the pressure and the leverage we're building. Because if the assumption is like, well, of course you have to negotiate, then we're always going to be taken for hostage, right? So yeah, I do think that it's pretty important for us to talk about. Even, of course, Anat also says, don't even say the word debt ceiling, but it's, featured very prominently in the name of this event, right? So it's like, we're not thinking about how we frame things even to ourselves. And she talks about it as, don't say work requirements, because that's their language. Talk about how it's benefits theft, right? So I just think that's a really important reminder to us as the organizers on the ground, when, or folks who might go out and talk to people in 2024 about why they should reject a Trump presidency again, and or a MAGA president, and vote for Biden again. How do we articulate why it's important to elect somebody who's going to defend the rights of veterans and working families and young people and children have access to their basic needs. So I do think that it's important for us to kind of get clear on that framing. And, you know, in terms of what's the impact for future fights, I would say, you know, we see this is what's going to happen again. The Democrats actually probably may be coming into that fight weaker in the future because there's going to be an appropriations fight in the fall. And so now there's a precedent been set for expanding these work requirements and taking benefits away from families. And it just seems like it's definitely going to be in the books that they're going to try to go after Medicaid this fall. And this time the public won't be paying as much attention because there's not going to be a default looming. So I think the fight, you know, this fiscal year is really going to be about the appropriations. So, and, you know, it just brings to mind for me some local example of, you know, a lot of this is about how do we build leverage, how do we build power for these budget fights. In San Francisco, we had our mayor do a kind of similar move in the sense that outside of the budget process, she proposed a police supplemental for about $27 million, right? Because the narrative right now is that public safety is out of control. The streets of San Francisco are dangerous, open air drug dealing, and therefore we need to crack down. And it's all about lock them up, kind of tough on crime policy, and that police don't have enough money to actually be out there doing their jobs, right? When we know that in San Francisco, police get paid the highest salary of any civil servant, and that they have the lowest rate of you know, solving crimes and like actually reducing crime. So, you know, she won that fight because it was a game of chicken between her and the board of supervisors. And because the narrative was so set around public safety, the board, you know, they played that role. They were not able to stand up to her proposal to say police need another $27 million. And, you know, if you don't vote for this, it's political suicide for you. So I think that there was the kind of, our board went into that negotiation really weak, and they ended up passing a supplemental outside of the budgeting process. And now the mayor has just released another budget for this next 2 fiscal years, saying she's going to, while she's cutting social programs, she's going to be increasing the police budget by over $60 million. So in total, she would have allocated $100 million for police this year. That, you know, to me is all about how it's about the narrative and it's about the policy, right? Like we have to win on both fronts. And so we do need to pay a lot of attention to those fights locally and also federally and nationally. So anyways, I think, you know, another point, since we're at this point now where today, you know, there's going to be a vote on the Senate floor. What do you think is next? As an economist, what do you think our points of intervention and places where we should be fighting are?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that, you know, a priority should be getting rid of the debt ceiling. That it's as I said before, it's not serving a useful purpose. It's just giving, you know, Republicans a chance to push for austerity in a way that they weren't in the budget process. It would be good to do so soon, also, and not just wait for the next crisis. So the problem is that even, you know, in a crisis, if Biden, for instance, had invoked the 14th Amendment and said, I'm going to keep paying the bills and I'm not going to, you know, negotiate at all with the Republicans, that would still create uncertainty in the economy. And so, you know, I think that would have been a good thing for Biden to do, but there would have been economic consequences. And so then the pressure then not to do anything, in that case, not to do anything that's going to create uncertainty and just to negotiate a deal is going to be very large. And so I really think that the getting rid of the debt ceiling needs to happen now before 2025 and before we're in a crisis again. And so not give basically the Republicans the chance to take the economy hostage like they were doing this time. I guess one thing, as Jason mentioned, you know, another option would be to raise the debt limit so high that it's not going to be binding anytime soon. So that would be another possibility. I guess, you know, I'm not a lawyer, but the lawyers say it may be difficult to challenge the debt limit in court because it's not clear who's been injured and so not clear who has standing to sue. And so, you know, it's possible, and that's something that we should debate and I think maybe should be considered, is maybe raising the debt limit very high might be another way of effectively removing this 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 weapon from the Republicans without but in a way that's doable without the courts. Anyway, so that seems like that should be a priority. I should mention that this is not an extreme view. Lots of mainstream economists, basically, including, I don't know, Mark Zandi from Moody's, or I was just reading something by David Leonhardt in the New York Times this morning, basically think this debt ceiling is just creating economic uncertainty. It's not actually serving any useful purpose. We don't need it. We should get rid of it. And so I think that's, a coalition could be built around this idea that actually we should just get rid of the debt ceiling or raise it very high. And then the other thing I would just say is, generally the progressives need the votes. The power in these budget negotiations come from having the votes, and so it really is important. The parties are not the same. That's become very clear here in this debate, and especially the progressive Democrats really need more votes in order to be at the table for these kind of negotiations. No, I think that the Progressive Caucus was saying, listen, we weren't consulted on this. This isn't our deal. But they had more votes. They would be at the table in an important way. So that seems, I think, what See the Vote's doing and going out and winning more seats for progressives, I think is an excellent thing to try to do. Let me turn it back to you. What do you think? What would you identify as the?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about power, right? A lot of negotiations are all about what leverage do you have and what power do you have in the negotiation, right? And I think in order for progressives and for us as left movements to actually have more power to protect benefits for working people, we have to be able to count the votes. And the reality is the Progressive Caucus knew they, even if they opposed and went against the deal in the House, that it was going to pass. Right. And so it was kind of like, it's a symbolic vote. No, it's not it's a vote that and even right now, I think there's Senator Kane has an amendment to remove the Mountain Valley Pipeline from the deal. He knows he doesn't have the votes. Right. It's kind of a symbolic move. But we need to move beyond symbolism to actual power. And how do we do that? We need to win seats in the House and in the Senate in 2024. Otherwise, there's no reason to include progressives at the table in the negotiating conversations. So I do think that it's, like you said, it's a very clear balance of power that's needed, and more progressive, members of Congress and in the Senate and House. And how do we get there? I think that that's the work we're doing to pave the way to 2024. Is that we need to have strong mobilization, and at the end of the day, from my experience being in Arizona, supporting volunteers who went to Georgia back in 2020 to win the first seat for Warnock and Ossoff, the reality is it's very important for us as organizers, for all of us, whether we do paid organizing work or not, to be on the streets, on the doors, or supporting in some other way, whether it's fundraising or not. And See the Vote as an organization is helping to make sure that we partner with grassroots movement building organizations in battleground states in 2024 so that we can mobilize resources, people power, who will be talking to the voters. And at the end of the day, this could be a conversation that a voter might bring up as well. Don't the Democrats just want to spend and like we're going out of control? It's like, well, how do you respond to that? It's important for us to actually understand what is that point to that voter, because we are going to need to win Republican voters, just like we did in Arizona, who are fed up with Trump and who are fed up with kind of the, really extremism and attack on democracy. So I do think that, the way forward is about winning power and winning, not just the top of the ticket, the presidential race, but also down ballot races are going to be really key. So I'll just stop there. And I think Rose is going to join us to add a few more questions and thoughts.
Can I say something say something just to reinforce something that Rose said at the beginning, which is the thing about that the Republicans really are becoming more and more extreme. And there's this sort of both sidesism view in the mainstream media and lots of mainstream people, centrist people thinking, well, you should really reach across the aisle and you should make a deal. So you should always be making the deals. And if they can't make a deal with both are to blame. That's not what's going on here. Like the Republicans have really become extreme on lots of dimensions. And so the Democrats need to be willing to stand up and say, no, we're not going to negotiate with them. They've gone, they're way off of beyond the pale. And they need, but Democrats in order to do that have to have, electoral strength to be able to give them that backbone to be able to say, no, we're not, it's not our fault. They're going, they're extreme and we're going to hold our ground. Sorry, Rose, go ahead.
No, thanks. I think that's a really great point. I was thinking, since we have a little bit more time in terms of some questions we could dig into a little bit more. that, one of the things we started talking about at the very beginning of this is how the Republicans, they're winning with their extremism, but they also are winning with this coherent narrative around the economy. And the Democrats are not so good at that. And so I thought, well, we have an economist here. Maybe we could ask some questions just to help us understand and like break down what's happening with the economy. So then we can think through like, how do we actually talk about it? And what is the narrative that we would want to fight for? Like, so about this budget fight, but also about the economy, more generally. So, like one question we could start with is, let's look at like what's happening right now, right? We know job growth is up, inflation is going down, wages are keeping steady, but what we're hearing is like a real doom and gloom narrative about the economy. And so is that right, that what I just said? And also like why is that happening?
Yeah, good question. Part what's happened recently, like since COVID, is there was inflation. Inflation was higher than lots of people expected. My view is that's largely because of the after effects of COVID, right? So that you sort of shut down the economy and then you start back up again. It's going to create supply chain blockages. It create lots of things that was happening not just in the United States, it's happening in lots of places, right? At the same time, Biden got through, and I think this is a good thing, a bunch of investment. In the future of the country, investment in green technology, and investment in on other dimensions as well. But I think what people are doing is they're saying, you hear it a lot from the right-wing media, which is it's that spending that generated the inflation. Okay, so that's one thing I think we need to counter. The inflation was happening in lots of places, and it's sort of an after effect of COVID, and it's actually calmed down. It probably would have calmed down on its own. But what happened in part was the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, raised interest rates, right, in order to, that's a classic way of trying to reduce inflation. But it also has the effect of cooling down the economy and may even, if they don't handle it right, may even induce recession, right? And that's part of related to the point I was saying, like austerity now, given the high interest rates that the Federal Reserve has implemented, would actually most likely drive us into recession. Now, so some people will say, well, it's a necessary thing in order to fight this inflation that Biden created. And the answer to that is no, the inflation was driven by the fact that we're coming out of out of the COVID crisis, right? The investments are things we have to make in order to increase growth in the future. Anyway, and austerity now would certainly drive us into recession, which otherwise we might be able to avoid, and just have a soft landing and maintain growth of the economy.
Thanks, Eric. I want to ask this question that maybe some folks in the audience might be thinking. How do we, as progressives, as folks on the left, as movement-oriented folks, how do we critique the deal, because we know that there's some really awful things in it, while also supporting Biden electorally, right? I think that this is an argument that the left has had for a really long time about engaging electoral politics generally. I think that folks really came together post-Trump to make sure there was not a second term. But how do we, what's your viewpoint on this, Rose, as someone who's leading Seed the Vote right now and has engaged with a ton of volunteers across the country, trying to hold on to our progressive values and what we stand for, while also realizing and recognizing the need to ensure the Republicans don't win the White House?
Yeah, well, I wish I had a perfect answer for this. Honestly, my gut is like, we just do it. We just do both things, like, because they actually, I don't think are contradictory, and when we're like, I feel like you all are bringing up so many points that remind us, and we'll talk about this again in the wrap up, but just if we want the budget battle to be different in 2025, there's some really concrete differences that are going to be needed. And we both, like the Dems, have to not lose the Senate and have to win the House. And also there needs to be a lot more progressive power built within both the House and the Senate to actually be able to pull things left. So it's like, one without the other isn't going to be enough. We need both. And so, it's like walking while chewing gum, or whatever that saying is. I think it feels hard and it feels weird, but I don't actually think it's a contradiction to be doing this. How we think about the electoral muscle and Seed the Vote is like, we throw down hard on these elections, and then we turn around and we do the legislative advocacy organizing to push many of these same people who we were knocking doors for to be a lot better. And we, as you know, many people have said before, we think of them as targets, not as our saviors. And so I think there's something like emotionally around the personal relationship, I think, on the organizing side of like how we relate to politicians, that for me, I'll say has been helpful in finding those things not to be contradictory. But I think it's just, we're in this really both and moment with what we're seeing from the right, and the path to power is to do both of these things. And so we have to do it. But I don't know, would either of you add anything to that?
I mean, the MAGA is clearly like, this is not a normal situation, and they really have to be, they really have to be countered, really have to be fought. So I think even those people who are kind of cynical about electoral politics generally, I think this is not the time to be cynical about electoral politics. We actually have to make sure Trump's not elected, and we have to make sure that these extreme right-wing guys are not in power. Anyway, that's my reaction. As a non-expert on these issues, but that's my honest reaction. What do you think, Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly why See the Vote was formed, was also to partner directly with organizations on the ground in these battleground states like Lucha in Arizona, or unions who have membership, in Georgia, and Working Families Party in Philadelphia, right? Like all these places that actually have groups on the ground who are doing the accountability work of, whoever gets elected down ballot, so that it is not just about the in and out cycle of elections, but it really is about what's the long-term power building plan, right? So this is a fight about democracy, and the kind of multiracial democracy we want has to recognize the importance of economic democracy, right? So I do think that it's important we kind of, like you said, Rose, we have to do both, and it's not easy or comfortable all the time, but it is kind of our task. It's like our historical moment and our historical task to bring the left and to bring this fight on the, to regular working people as we talk to them on the doors about what their vote means and what the impact is. Because I think you're right, we're in a moment now that is not normal. And I think many of us, people who study democracies are really looking at the United States of like, what is going to happen after this next election? We don't have the luxury to sit it out. We don't have the luxury to let the mainstream Democratic Party, they're definitely not going to be our savior. And so I think we do have to take it in our own hands and work with groups like See the Vote to get out there and support movement building organizations across the country.
Just hearing you talk is making me think of one other piece, which is just, I mean, I think there's some of us who are going to be deep in the grassroots organizing between election cycles and need to be more convinced to do the electoral work. And then there's some people in the reverse. And so, I do think staying engaged in these federal fights, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this event with Convergence magazine, is because we think like, actually, we can't, just elect these people and then shut our eyes for 2 years and then hope in 2 years it's going to feel different when we're doing this again. And so this, there is the grassroots organizations on the ground are doing this work. This organizing is happening. It's not just, we're not just saying, right, like when elections build our movements in between, like there is work happening, but how much power, how much people power is behind them supporting these fights when all eyes aren't on them in the same way outside of these election seasons. And so I think there's that both and of, you really can't have one without the other. And we're in a funny moment with this budget fight where it's a little bit over, but there's a lot of work. There was a lot of fighting that did happen. And as Emily, you outlined before, with where sort of progressive forces are within the Democratic Party, there were some limitations in terms of how much they could win this time. So, but there are pieces around this we can continue to work on, and there may be opportunities to take action even before this next budget fight in 2025, even before the election, around strengthening things for the budget next time. So we'll talk a little more about that, but just want to say, there, it's that both and wherever you're stronger on, we need you on the other side too.
Yeah.
No, and the reality is that many people tune in when there's a fight like this or something is in the news in this way. And so if we can engage them and get them involved, and there I'm not talking about professional organizers, I'm talking about just people on the ground, that seems very important. So how to leverage moments like this in order to build a broader coalition seems a very important thing to think about.
Definitely. And I think, we're thinking in a 10-year arc. I think a lot of orgs are talking about that right now. And that's one thing that helps keep me hopeful about what we're trying to actually build. And when we're thinking about power, is that it makes the disappointments like this big compromise feel they still feel really bad. So like we can feel that. And also I feel a North Star of where we're going towards and what we're trying to build so that the next fight is different and that 3 budget fights down the road is really different. And that keeps me hopeful even when the amount of power we have right now means that we're making some compromises that have some real hard impacts and that we want to honor those too. Do we, I think we're going to transition soon, but I don't know if either of you have a final question for each other or for us at large before we wrap it up. Or do we want to close it here?
Well, maybe this is a question I can pose to Eric, but for folks sitting at home who are working hard in their local community organization or fighting their own local budget fights, and also looking at how is this going to impact them locally from an economic standpoint of this deal. How are the impacts to assistance for the programs that are getting cut or reductions? How do you see that? Is there a trickle down that people should be looking for locally, or how do we understand that kind of impact for people working grassroots and also in the States?
Yeah, I mean, so we should be clear that a cap on spending, given that there's inflation, right, is effectively you're cutting how much you're investing in how much you're spending, right? And so even the next year or two, spending is not going to keep up with inflation, and so that is going to have a little bit of a it's going to be depressing the economy a bit. Okay, and so we may see that. Now, maybe that was the best deal that the Democrats could get if they were going to make a deal. I don't really have a sense of that. Maybe with divided government, that the Democrats we're going to have to give up a little bit on spending priorities. But I think the reality is going to be on the ground. You are going to see less growth, and you'll have a cooling down of the economy. You'll have more slack in the labor market. I expect unemployment is going to continue to rise. Now, partly it's hard to separate those things from, well, is that a recession happening, or is that an effect of the federal spending? But I think we are going to see that, and I think there are real consequences apart from the people now who are going to have additional work requirements. People 50 to 54 are going to have work requirements to get the food stamps. Incidentally, which is not going to cut much at all from spending. It was sort of a symbolic gesture on the part of the Republicans. But I think we are going to see that, and so those budget fights are important. I mean, I think both they're important for how much the economy overall grows and how the economy overall performs. When you start cutting, or you start cutting in effectively in real terms, that is going to have a contractionary effect, I guess, the economist word, even at the local level. And so in that sense, I think people do need to engage in what's happening at the federal level. And there's the danger, actual social programs being cut. And so that, a lot of those decisions happen at the federal level. So even people who are focused locally do have to pay attention to what's happening at the national budget level, and get tooled up for the fall, when there'll be a budget appropriations discussion happening again.
Thanks, Eric. And I just wanted to add one more point about kind of what's next for us in terms of fights. I think that, at the very beginning of this, negotiation, the Republicans were talking about cutting Medicare and Social Security, but Democrats kind of went on offense because Medicare and Social Security are very popular, right? And so when they kind of when Biden mentioned it in his State of the Union, the Republicans then had to go on all the talk shows and say they don't want to do that because they know it's not popular, when they have to actually name the programs. And so I think it's the next thing is that it's easier for Republicans to do these cross the board cuts and through these negotiations behind the back door, because they don't have to name what they're cutting, at the outset. And when we name the programs that really impact people, they don't want to cut it, actually. And so I think that's the next fight for us to do better on as a movement, is to really name those things and force, push the Dems to do better on, calling it out, and then being able to be just more offensive than defensive. So anyways, I'll pass it back to Rose and Jason for closing us out.
Great. Thank you, Emily. I mean, thank you. Thanks to the three of you. I think personally, I feel I'm someone who gets confused about this budget fight and a lot of what we see in the mainstream media about it. And I feel much clearer on a lot of pieces of it now. And I hope some of you, if not all of you listening, feel that way as well. So so grateful to to Eric and Emily for helping us understand more about the debt and what potential winning positions around it are for our movements going forward. And Jason, for you really laying down what happened in this fight super clearly. Also want to thank Sandra Hinson, who created a lot of the content for this event, and Karina Hurtado Ocampo, who created the visuals on the slide. So thank you both as well. And Sam, who's doing all the tech behind the scenes right now. So obviously this was a pretty big topic for us to try and cover in an hour. And, especially because we're looking at multiple angles, right? We're looking at the narrative fight, the political fight, getting into some of the economics at play. And we didn't have time for your all's questions and thoughts, those of you who are joining us tonight. So we're actually going to host a follow-up discussion, See the Vote Is. That's going to be a more intimate conversation where you can ask follow-up questions, share some of your own thoughts. I know some people have added into the chat, but get to share more of your thoughts and talk through future strategy together, add your own pieces to what was talked about tonight. And so that's going to be on June 13th at 5 p.m. Pacific. And the link to sign up for that is going to be going into the chat in just a minute. So hope you all will consider joining us and continuing the conversation together. Also, Convergence is doing really amazing coverage right now for any of you not already following them, writing and talking about the right and bringing in brilliant organizers and strategists to talk about how we're going to keep fighting them. So I really hope you keep following along with them if you're not already, and also that you'll consider joining them in their upcoming June fundraising campaign. And you can find Convergence at convergencemag.com, which that link will also be shared in the chat. But they're just such an invaluable resource, and I'm really excited to keep following along with these fights with Convergence. So, Emily and Eric spoke earlier to the need to strengthen the progressive push to get rid of the debt ceiling and not to wait until the next crisis. So just want to recognize that is like a potential current or soon to be fight that we could all be a part of. It's a little bit too soon to know whether there's like one specific mass action that's ready for us to go on that. But we will keep you updated whether us or any of our allies are doing any work around that. I know a lot of our national partners, Working Families Party, People's Action, and others have been doing a lot of great work on the budget fight, and there may be more actions called for. So we'd love to keep you all updated as those opportunities arise. And so, lastly, Emily already made this point, but, and I said a little bit before, but we're never going to be the people to tell you the solution to everything is an election. But in this case, it is just absolutely true that for the budget battle to look different in 2025 and beyond, the Dems have to win the House, they have to keep the Senate, and we have to build more progressive power within both. And so I really hope, whether it's through See the Vote and our wonderful grassroots partners or other movement groups doing key election work in battleground states, that you all plug in the ways that make sense for you, so that next time we're telling a different budget story than the one that we've had a great time telling tonight, but we want the story to be different next time. So excited to make that happen with all of you. And thanks for being here and spending an hour listening to us talk about the budget. Excited. Hope to see you at the follow-up event. And thanks again, and have a great rest of your night.